Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Brissenden-Smith. I am a partner with Impact Media Partners, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special live event featuring clips from the powerful new film, The 5 Demands, coming to PBS later this year. Today's event will be a discussion of equity and access to education featuring distinguished guests from the NAACP, Brooklyn College, and Maryland Public Television, and moderated by veteran journalist and host of CUNY-TV's One-to-One, Sheryl McCarthy. We encourage you to share your questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature throughout the event, as we'll have an opportunity to take some of your questions later on in the discussion. At this time, we'll watch a brief trailer for the 5 Demands, and then Sheryl will join us to introduce our panel and begin the conversation. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoy the event.
The first thing that struck me, coming through Harlem, surrounded by Harlemites, my folks, and then entering the college and finding there weren't any of my folks.
We had to have a strategy on how to open the doors for more people like us.
Black and Puerto Rican students chained the gates to City College of New York, closing it.
Shall be free, yeah.
We shall be free. Everybody gonna get together and walk like you and me.
We shall be free, yeah.
We shall be free.
So power to the people, power.
Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'll be moderating this discussion about the historic student strike that took place at the City College of New York in April 1969. Led by Black and Latino students, the protesters took over an entire section of the campus, shutting down classes and other campus activities for 17 days. How that protest changed City College and affected university education nationwide is the subject our panelists will be discussing today. They are Wisdom Cole, National Director of the NAACP Youth and College Division. In this role, he serves more than 700 youth councils, high school chapters, and college chapters that are actively involved in the fight for civil rights. Travis Mitchell, Senior Vice President and Chief Content Officer for Maryland Public Television. He oversees all of the content acquired that airs on Maryland's public TV channels. And Maria Perez y Gonzalez, who is Professor of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College and Founding Director of Latinas in Ministry. Welcome to all of you. In the 1960s and 70s, there were hundreds of student protests at colleges and universities all around the country. Among the issues, the civil rights movement, the protests against the Vietnam War, gender equality, the push for racial and ethnic diversity in college enrollments and courses of study, and the often indifferent treatment of the neighborhoods of color by the academic institutions nearby. So what were the 5 demands of the City College strikers? 1, a separate school of Black and Puerto Rican studies. 2, a separate orientation program for Black and Puerto Rican students. 3, a voice for Sikh students in setting guidelines for the Sikh program, which was a remediation program for students who needed extra help with college work. 4, that entering classes at the college reflect the racial composition of New York City's high schools, which was more than 50% Black and Latino. And finally, that Black and Puerto Rican history and Spanish language be requirements for all education majors. You've all seen the documentary, and I'm interested in getting your reactions to it. Why don't we start with you, Maria?
I've seen the entire documentary and it is fabulous. It is inspiring, has great music, and has voices from the various perspectives, the students involved, faculty members, seat counselors, and other students who were involved, some who, right, did not quite approve or did not understand what was going on and why they were locked out. This resonates with me. Yes, I've been a professor at Brooklyn College in the Department of what was then Puerto Rican Studies, now Puerto Rican and Latinx Studies, for 32 years now. But I am also a beneficiary of that struggle in CUNY, because it took place not only at City College, but at Lehman College, Hunter College, Brooklyn College, and other entities, right? Other campuses of the City University of New York. And so in 1985, 86, I began taking classes in Puerto Rican studies. So I'm not only a CUNY graduate from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, I'm also a beneficiary of the Department of Puerto Rican Studies at John Jay College, which is, I cannot say how valuable that was to me. I did not see myself reflected in any of the curriculum, not from kindergarten all the way into college years. So it was about my 4th year out of the 5. I was doing my bachelor's and master's at John Jay. So in my 4th year, I found the Puerto Rican Studies department and I took a course and it blew my mind. I had never heard any of the things that were being discussed and the critiques and the perspectives, nothing about myself. And so it changed my life. And so here I am.
Okay, so the strike had a real impact on you personally.
Absolutely.
Wisdom, tell me your reaction to the film.
Well, thank you so much, Cheryl, and it's great to be here with everybody. You know, my first reaction to the film was this quote by Frederick Douglass: "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." And as a student of the Black student movement, you know, to be able to see and hear the history of how Black students have come together to demand more of our university, to demand more of our predominantly white institutions. You know, I got my start in activism in the state of California as a student organizer with the African Black Coalition. And this was, you know, after the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin, after the murder of Michael Brown, where young people were trying to call the question of, does Black Lives Matter? And not just in the streets, but in our universities, in our institutions, predominantly white institutions. You know, I was on a campus where white students had thrown beer bottles at Black students, where I was the residential assistant for our Rosa Parks African American theme house, which we had to fight for. And on the first day that we opened, we had white students run through our building, tear down posters, and make students feel uncomfortable. Right? You know, this need for our own spaces, the need for recognition, the need for young students of color to be able to have the spaces that feel safe to them and provide them with the needs that are necessary for them to be successful, right? If we say education is the passport for tomorrow, we have to make sure that we are providing a space that is accessible to all and allowing all to be a part of it for us to study. And so even seeing this documentary, it reminded me so much of my own history, as well as the current climate that we live in. You know, young people have always been at the forefront of the demands for change. And they are going to the university saying, we need this, this, and that. You know, in my early career as an activist, we demanded of the University of California system to provide Black mental health professionals, to provide Black student housing, to provide Black resource centers, right? Things that are going to allow Black students to stay at university, or more so matriculate. And so just to see this film showed me that I'm a part of a long lineage of young organizers, young activists who've been fighting for the same things that we're fighting for today.
And even now you're supporting other young people, other college students in their activism. Travis, your response to the film.
Well, first and foremost, MPT is proud to be the presenting station for this film, because we think it's an important conversation. We think the conversation that will ensue, because those who are able to watch the film, will help us understand why young people, possess the power to not only challenge systems, but to fight for ongoing change. And we see some of the issues that the students were fighting for in the 70s remain issues of inclusive access that are plaguing our systems today. But I think what we have to understand is why young people possess such power. And it's because of their pursuit for the truth. And when you pursue the unvarnished truth, it often will place you on a path to step towards your destiny. Many of the activists found their voices on those campuses and have continued to this day to fight for a more inclusive democracy and fight for a better tomorrow by activating, mobilizing today. It reminds me, growing up in the South, a similar fight, but a different fight. My parents, growing up in North Carolina, couldn't attend predominantly white institutions because of the color of their skin. It was students of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. That Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was launched at historically Black Shaw University in 1960. My mother was a student at Shaw University, where the lunch counter boycotts began, and SNCC took it upon themselves to really mobilize college campuses across the country and really open up this democracy to live out the fullest meaning of its creed. But why students? Because students were not afraid to lose something that they didn't have. They were hoping for a better America. They were hoping for a better tomorrow. And so they were willing to put their lives on the line to open up the nation for generations yet unborn. And I believe the idealism of students is the power that they have to effect change. And so what we can draw from the film is that we really should encourage our students to be active participants in shaping the country that they will inherit. We should not discourage activism, we should encourage it. But it's all fundamental and a part of our ability to be full participants in a democracy. And I think that's what the film is going to help us understand, that each one of us has a responsibility, a civic responsibility, to make sure that all of us participate in this American dream.
As someone who grew up in Birmingham, Alabama in the 60s, I'm well aware of the, well, under Jim Crow, what that was about, and of the role that young people, sometimes very young people, played in overthrowing those restrictions. I tell you, some of my reactions to the film, first of all, I was very surprised that I had never heard about the 69 strike at City College. I mean, we'd all heard about, you know, the freedom of speech protests at Berkeley, the takeover by the Columbia students, the armed protesters at Cornell University, but you know, nothing about the City College strike. Were you surprised? Did you know about it, or were you surprised to learn about it yourselves?
Well, I've been in Puerto Rican studies for a long time already, so I was familiar with it. I am part of the CUNY system. I was surprised that this film wasn't done earlier, actually. And so I was glad to see it come out. But it's not unlike what's happening today under the student activist protests that are going on campuses. The media tends to focus, with its bias, on the elite institutions, not the public institutions, publicly funded. And so those stories are really important to bring out, precisely because the students in CUNY, right, are the students who are often forgotten about or marginalized from lower income families, disadvantaged backgrounds, perhaps. And so it's not a surprise to me that we don't know the story, right? On my virtual background, you see the book that I co-edited with Dr. Virginia Sanchez-Coral. It's Puerto Rican Studies in the City University of New York, the first 50 years. And here there is a chapter on City College that Dr. Connor Thomas Reed wrote. And so if anyone wants to know a little more, there's some information there. But the book focuses on part of the ethnic studies struggles, right? The Black studies, Puerto Rican studies, it studies on, focuses on that, but it gives a context, the book, in the different chapters as to what went on, the struggles, the many strikes, the many protests, the many lockdowns that were happening all across CUNY to help establish ethnic studies in the City University of New York.
I was also shocked, though in retrospect, I don't know why, by the fact that this city college is right in the middle of Harlem, in the middle of Harlem. And yet there were so few Black students who were enrolled or who were encouraged to come there or who could get in. That really shocked me. So let's talk about. I just want to run through what were the 5 demands. They were asking for a separate school of Black and Puerto Rican studies, a separate orientation program for Black and Puerto Rican students, a voice for Sikh students and setting guidelines for the Sikh program. This was a program of remedial help for students who needed help with college level work. That entering classes at the college reflect the racial composition of New York City's high schools, which was more than 50% Black and Latino, and that Black and Puerto Rican history and Spanish language be requirements for all education majors. We're going to take a look at a clip from the film.
I grew up very poor and very working class. And the schools, they didn't know what to do with us. I wasn't really taught how to read, how to write, and they had specific programs where they tracked us into. So the program I was into was to be a nurse's aide, learn how to take care of people. So I didn't even think about going to college.
You weren't left out of college because you were dumb or because you couldn't learn. You were left out because the way society is structured, okay? And you weren't structured into that process.
It's actually quite un-American. You have people who have been here for 400 years. They are paying the same taxes, they're riding the same subway, and they have the same dreams for their children, which is to be well educated, to be well spoken, to be in a career of their choice and not forced to do menial tasks for everyone else.
Now sit down, Sharon, and straight up. Okay, now what did you do?
In the 50s and even in the 60s, in predominantly Black and Puerto Rican schools, the curriculum was very soft and the books were very old. The teachers were newly minted coming out of college, who had the most inexperienced teachers teaching in the ghetto schools.
Get over there and sit down. Sit down. Wait. 5, 10, 20, 25, 30. Everybody.
So for someone to say that Black and brown people are arriving at CCNY without a proper foundation, who caused that to be? Who kept that in place?
As the people in the film point out, for years before the 1969 strike, it was widely believed that Blacks, Puerto Ricans were not capable of doing college level work. Has that perception changed in the 55 years since the strike?
I don't know if the perception per se has changed, because we see a lot of misinformation about the abilities of Black and brown students to compete at the highest levels of academia, which fuels these rollbacks of affirmative action which suggests that Black and brown students somehow are getting into college because of their race and not their capabilities, when the opposite is true. What I will simply say that what is going under discussed and under addressed is the point that was made in the film. And that is, if you look at how higher education is structured, it is my belief and my lived experience that you're seeing gaps in educational achievement that exist because of lack of access to resources and not academic capabilities. You have many poor urban and minority school districts where students who are coming into kindergarten have not had pre-K education. Yet they're competing in a system where some students have come in and have full 2 or 3 years of pre-K education. That gap is never closed. And so third grade reading proficiency levels are lagging with Black and brown students and poor students. By the time you get to 8th grade, you have students who do not have the prerequisite skills or exposure to handle algebra. And so these are the predictors of higher education success for those students who are going into STEM-related fields or pursuing highly competitive degree programs at the higher levels. And what do you do when you have urban and rural school districts that don't offer anything more than Algebra 2? This is not the fault of students. This is a resource allocation issue that has to be addressed. And so one final point that I would make is, why do students seem to thrive in environments where they see teachers who look like them, or when they are in school systems where people live in the neighborhoods they live in and can relate to their own experience? I believe part of it is that kind of familiarity creates increased student engagement. If I can relate to you, then I'm going to listen to you. And so you have a large swath of students who disengage from the educational process because they don't see the material as being relevant to who they are and where they live. And so if we are serious about America being globally competitive, some of the investments that we would make would be towards increasing student engagement, increasing student enrichment, and making sure that there's a level playing field so that students have access to all of the academic resources necessary to build their skills in the critical grades of K through 8, so that the pipeline of students that's available to access higher education is fully prepped and fully developed to achieve those higher educational goals.
I might point out that even though the perception of Black and Latino students' capability or incapability of doing college work, even though that perception may not have changed, the reality has changed a lot as more Blacks and Latinos are attending college and earning college degrees. In 2022, the college enrollment rate among those 18 to 24 years old was 41% for Asians, 41% for whites, 36% for Blacks, and 33% for Latinos. So obviously, Blacks and Latinos are really pursuing a college education and are edging up on the enrollment rate of white students. We're going to look at another clip from the film.
That was a radical time for white students, too. A lot of the white students stood in front to protect us and enable us to continue to be there. So they were our comrades, our allies, and they had our back.
During the strike, my concern was, what in the world's going to happen to our semester? We were careerists. We wanted to make sure the semester continued as it was, because we have our mundane aspirations just to advance ourselves another step further and hopefully someday to be a college professor.
We don't want a small group of troublemakers to take over the campus.
We want the school, the racial composition of the City College of New York to be representative of the high schools of the city of New York, which is 57%.
You can check this with the Board of Ed. 57% of the public school students are Black and Puerto Rican. The thing is that racism is hurting everybody here, and discrimination is hurting all peoples.
Why don't you join the majority?
I am joining the majority of Americans who want a better life in this country.
Well, the majority around you doesn't seem to support that. What does the majority say? That's what the majority says.
The people standing around here are not the majority because
well, the people certainly are not.
Wow, I think I held my own there. It's funny, you know, I don't remember that. But now seeing it, I feel like, you know, I knew what was important and I stood up. And you notice I don't see any women yelling at me. It all seems to be like it's all these big men like converging on me. So they were not the majority.
She really was a firebrand. Maria, this question is for you. In the film, we saw white students and white faculty who were deeply divided in their opinions about the strike, even though many white students did join the protesters. Do you think white students and faculty today are more sympathetic to the concerns of Black and Latino students?
I think so. At least that's been my experience at Brooklyn College in CUNY. And evidence for that, I guess, is that, you know, in my particular department of Puerto Rican Latinx studies, we had been severely understaffed. And, you know, these are some of the problems that happen with ethnic studies everywhere, right? Understaffing affects, you know, you can't hire faculty or staff and you can't retain students because they, you know, they don't have people who look like them, who have gone through their experiences to teach them, et cetera. So we were severely understaffed. The people who helped us through the union in particular, right? Many of our white colleagues, and of course our African-American colleagues, right? We've always stood with the African-American community, the Black community. But indeed, just as in the late 1960s and early 70s, like the film shows, where you have a group of white students, and at Brooklyn College, it was white radical Jewish middle income students who actually stood up and stood beside the Black and Puerto Rican students to establish these departments and fought for that. And so I think today, through the unions and our colleagues, specifically in the humanities and social sciences and the arts in particular, there is much more understanding and camaraderie and support for the students, as has been shown recently when the campus takeovers, right? Have happened recently. The faculty and the of all colors and races were standing by the students. So I think there is a lot more understanding and support, but this is also New York City. And so I'll leave it at that.
Is the understaffing in the Puerto Rican studies and Latin studies programs, is that because of they're undervalued when it comes to funding? I find it hard to believe that there aren't people qualified to teach in those programs.
Oh no, there are many people qualified to teach in the programs, but as has happened since its founding pretty much, right? You have just a few years after the ethnic studies were founded at CUNY, you have the crisis, the fiscal crisis.
Right.
And so, you know, historically, you know, the politicians cut back on CUNY, even though City University of New York is the #1 social, the social engine of social mobility to climb up for students in the city. The funding keeps lacking. And so it's a constant fight. And so that trickles down to the local levels on the campuses. So that diversity is huge at CUNY. We have about 77% of our students are students of color. That's not reflected in the faculty. It's not reflected in the administration, but definitely in the students. And so we have this this setback, right? So it trickles down to each of the campuses. So we talk a big talk about diversity, but when it comes to putting money into departments and hiring, that's a little harder to come by. And so we see mergers and we see sort of these conglomerates of ethnic studies, rather than getting the support in terms of general education, where every student sort of has to take this. And although A few years ago, there was a move for that. And so students are taking a little bit more diversity courses, but not everyone's required to take a Black Studies or a Puerto Rican Latinx Studies course. And I think that's a great disservice, especially in New York City. And our students go from here to everywhere, but you should know something about your neighbors, about the world, right? About people that are different from you. And so that's important to keep those things in mind, because we do need to learn from each other. Otherwise, we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes over and over, and the most vulnerable are going to be the ones that suffer the most. And that's us.
Wisdom, I had asked if there tends to be support for the concerns, the issues of students of color. And my question to you is, because you work with young people of color, what are their issues? What are certainly young Black people and young students passionate about these days?
Yeah, young people are passionate about a plethora of issues, but even thinking about it in relationship to this film, I think young people are getting more attuned to structural racism and what are the institutional changes that need to happen to ensure our success, right? Like I look at the fifth demand that Black and Puerto Rican history and Spanish language be a requirement for all education majors, right? The point of that demand was to ensure that the future educators in the city of New York were doing the best they can to reach Black and Spanish language students, right? To make sure that there are actually changing the full course of events, not just a moment, right? Earlier we talked about the increase of young people of color, attending institutions of higher education. That's great. That's amazing. But are those students being retained? Are they matriculating, right? In my past life, I was a high school STEM teacher. One of the universities that we would literally help and support students getting into, we eventually found out that those students were not being retained at the university. And so they were starting their first year, leaving either through the first semester or by the end of the year, saddled with student debt and no education, no job, and no prospects, right? And so what I'm seeing right now with our young people across this nation is like, one, they are picking up the mantle and they're running with it, right? They are innovating the way in which they protest, and the way in which they build power, and the way in which they are recognizing the issues, the structural issues in our higher education system. But they're also saying that enough is enough, right? If you aren't succumbing to our demands, to the issues that are most important to us, then maybe we don't want to attend your institution. Maybe we want to attend another institution. Maybe we want to attend an HBCU. Maybe we want to attend a Hispanic Serving Institute. Maybe we want to go to an institution where we know that our identities are going to be affirmed, where we're going to be retained, and we're going to be supported in the longevity of our college cycle. And so I think what young people are looking for and are fighting for is a new deal for their future, right? In the economy that we exist in the climate that we exist in, with our political climate that is currently in existence with this upcoming election, young people are saying enough is enough and demanding more of us in every single way. And now the question
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there does seem to have been a lot of support across racial lines for the Black Lives Matter movement. At least people are hanging signs that Black Lives Matter everywhere now, whether that's genuine or not. But there does that movement does seem to have garnered a lot of support across racial lines. Do you agree?
Absolutely. That was one of the movements that politicized me, that said, like, me as a young science student who's interested in going to medical school, just staying in my lane, I was like, hey, I'm seeing this happen in my community. I'm seeing this happening across the country. Other people that I'm going to school with, my colleagues, my Black and brown and white counterparts, are all seeing this, right? And we are calling the question.
Use of Black people by law enforcement people, right?
Exactly, right. And we're calling the question, it's like, it's not enough just for you to say Black Lives Matter, but are you actually willing to be allies? Are you actually willing to be in solidarity with us? And what are you willing to do to ensure this actually matters, right? We talked a little bit earlier about how universities will talk about diversity. They will put, I was a Black student on a pamphlet that was handed out to other students to come and attend, right? And it's not enough just to see the representation, but what are we actually doing to make sure there are structural changes to that university, to those institutions, and how are our peers actually leaning in to do that as well?
Right. We're going to play one more clip from the film.
Probably the biggest education leap for Black Americans happened at City University, especially immediately after the takeover. And I mean that nationally.
The really great result of open admissions, not only at the City University, but across the country, is that we've changed the story. And the expectation is if you want to go to school, you can go to school and you can succeed.
It is an honor for me to stand in front of you today representing the graduating class. I was born and raised in Yemen, and before migrating with my family to the United States, I couldn't have imagined attending college simply because we weren't allowed to. My sisters weren't allowed to, girls before me weren't allowed to. I fought to be allowed to pursue an education, for the right to be here. As I am sure all of you standing in front of me today fought for the same thing. We earned the right to be here.
When I was a freshman at this school, right, I remember hearing people talk about diversity all the time, but I didn't really understand what it meant. And I absolutely did not understand or appreciate what it's worth. So what I'm telling you is that diversity of people gives rise to diversity of thought. Diversity of people allows us to be a stronger student body, go on to be a stronger workforce, economy, and a stronger nation. And I say to you, esteemed First Lady, you can tell the President that his dreams for our nation have been alive and well at City College for decades and will be for decades to come.
There is a reason why, of all of the colleges and universities in this country, I chose this particular school in this particular city. You represent more than 150 nationalities, just about every possible background, every color and culture, every faith and walk of life. So graduates, with your glorious diversity, you all embody the very purpose of this school's founding.
This question is addressed to Travis and then to Maria. The strike at City College did seem to light a spark. In 1969, 97% of City College students were white. As of 2022, 15% were white, 37% were Hispanic, 15% were Black, and 23% were Asian. Throughout CUNY, which has 225,000 students on 25 campuses, the breakdown is now 23% white, 30% Latino, 25% Black, 21% Asian. So as we've said before, CUNY is a very diverse place, racially, ethnically, in terms of the countries that people are from, in terms of the languages that they speak. Do you think that spark has been lit nationally? That diversity thing has really taken off since 1969? Travis and then Maria.
Yes and no. It's not a very clear-cut answer. I mean, we know that there's an increase, as you stated the facts, there's an increase of Black and brown students who have accessed higher education. But there are pockets and selection and a selection of institutions and states that are still practicing selective discrimination and exclusion. And so the fight remains. I think the spark that is intergenerational is, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? And so sparks of student activism, when seeds are planted in cultures, that produces leaders who rise up in multiple generations who are striving to effect change. My own experience as a student leader, I mentioned student activism in the 60s, 68, 69, or 67, 68, 69, that was a wave of student protest on campuses, not just in the SUNYs, but on HBCU campus. They were fighting for a myriad of causes, Vietnam being one of them. But the time—
You were at Morgan State. You were at Morgan State University.
Yeah, Morgan State. And so students were fed up. And so in the 90s, something very similar happened where there was a wave of student protests across the country. HBCUs, for instance, were fighting against state practices of historic underfunding. So as a student leader in 1990, I led one of the largest student protests in Maryland's history, which included a hunger strike and a 40-mile walk to Annapolis to fight for the state to redress 50 years of systemic underfunding. And the students realized that their actions then needed to move the needle toward the state funding a 25-year capital improvement plan that had been put forth by the university that would far outlive us. As a result of the activism, the university received $1.5 billion in funding for capital improvements, and the protest was the spark for a class action lawsuit on behalf of 5 HBCUs against the state of Maryland that was settled just last year for $577 million. So here's my point. Where seeds of activism have been planted, and you have seen change and you've seen some growth, what you've done is you've created a network of advocates and activists that will fight to continue to push for change. But what we cannot assume is that one fight, one protest has remedied the historic practice of exclusion. This has to be a continuous fight to keep education open and accessible to all. And I think that's what movements like the 5 Demands have done. They've been seed planting movements. They've been network building movements that have continued to create the type of advocates and activists that will fight to keep access to education open for all.
Maria, obviously, as we said, CUNY is very, very diverse. Do you see that in other colleges and universities? Do you see that spreading?
I think Travis is right. Yes and no. Yes and no. Well, there's no easy answer. That's what education is about. There's no straight answers. But I think what's really important is that students, right, in their sort of their moral conscience would not allow them, right, to stand by. They said basta ya, right? Enough is enough, I think was said already here. And the students saw that and they said, no, we want representation, we want inclusion, we want people to learn about who we are. We are part of the American fabric of life as well. And we deserve to be part of that curriculum reflected in the curriculum, et cetera. And yes, I think that whole spark, right? Black studies, Chicano studies, Mexican American studies, Puerto Rican studies, Judaic studies, Asian American studies, Native American studies, and so on and so forth, right? The civil rights movements sort of culminated in that moment. And when those, the strikes and the disruptions happened across New York City and in other places. So there's been a lot that has resulted positively from that, and a lot more students of color entering the universities, faculty entering the, faculty of color entering the university systems. But still, in all, as we see today, right, there's a backlash. And so, I mean, the backlash began as soon as the Civil Rights Act was passed. Within those first few years, people were already, right, some in the white segment of society were already trying to overturn that. And they've been trying and continued little by little to chip away at different plans that allow people like me to have an opportunity. I am a first generation college student in CUNY. My mother was the first to graduate from high school, and she came here when she was 5, brought by her, right, citizen immigrant parents. Puerto Ricans are citizen immigrants. And she was able to achieve high school, and then I came and I was able to achieve college all the way up through the doctorate, right? And so I didn't know a lot of things that my peers did, but I learned it along the way, and I'm still learning after being in academia for so long. But one thing I did learn, right, that some people say, no, everybody's on an equal playing field now. All of those programs worked for affirmative action. Look at how far people have come, people of color. No, not in comparison, right? Not in comparison to the injustices and the blockades that have been placed, particularly in education, that keep people from
And of
climbing
course,
that
last
social
week you
ladder.
had the Supreme Court that banned, the use of consideration of race in college admissions.
Exactly.
It's interesting. I was talking to Evan Mander. He's a CUNY professor of criminal justice and the author of a book about affirmative action and admissions policies at the Ivy League and elite colleges. And he happened to have gone to Harvard, but he said that he believes the only institutions that really practice affirmative action for students of color are CUNY and the historically Black colleges. Would you agree with that, Travis?
What I would say is that by the virtue of their founding, the histories of HBCUs have indicated they've been some of the original interracial play and safe spaces for inclusion in the country, because what people forget, many HBCUs were founded not by Black people, they were founded by white people. The other issue with that is that in many of the rural areas, it wasn't just newly freed slaves that went to the schools, there were poor white students attending those institutions as well. And this was the great social experiment of the time, where was higher education even possible for newly freed slaves? Were poor people been able to be educated? And we see some amazing gains. For instance, Shaw University, the oldest HBCU in the South that I mentioned earlier, not only was established in 1865, but in less than 15 years had a law school and a medical school. So you had, in fact, Shaw had the only four-year medical school in the country, not Black medical school, the only four-year medical school in the country. And this is 15 years after inception. So why? Because again, the notion that people of color, poor people, could not be educated was not based on any fact. It was simply the human ability to learn should not be excluded to any groups of people. And so these places of SUNY and HBCUs have created safe spaces for people to be all they were created to be. You arrive on campus, you see people that look like you, you're in a space that affirms you for who you are, and you don't have to change to fit in, and it creates the recipe for your academic success. So yes, those spaces have been some of the most multicultural, most diverse, and I think here's the word, they're some of the most authentic spaces for you to be who you're supposed to be. And this is the fundamental challenge that I think higher education institutions are going to face. As Wisdom mentioned before, you cannot manufacture true diversity. If you attempt to use kind of artificial means to make it seem that you're diverse, students are going to withdraw and find places that accept them for who they are. I think the great equalizer to all of this is going to be the marketplace. And so when you start to see mass withdrawals of students who are in search of places that affirm them for who they are, that will create another effort to create diversity and equity, but it just won't be mandated by law. The marketplace will dictate it.
Right. Well, my mother went to Tuskegee. My brother went to Fisk. My niece went to Hampton. My father went to a little tiny Black college, Miles College in Birmingham. So, I know the value that HBCUs have played in creating the Black middle class. Wisdom. We started out talking about the student strike at City College, but recently, there have been hundreds of student protests around the country around the Israel-Hamas war and about US support for Israel. A lot of controversy over how colleges and universities and there's been a lot of controversy about how colleges and universities have handled these protests. Do you have any thoughts, any feelings about these protests and how the protesters have been treated?
Absolutely. As I stated, this is a continuation of the legacy of young people standing up for what they believe is right, right? I think that what we're seeing across this nation is young people being strategic about how they're engaging with their universities, how they're engaging with their peers, and putting those demands forward, right? The use of encampments, of living outside, of blockades, of stopping business as usual. Some of the folks that I learned from who were elders of the Black Panther Party, said that protest was used to stop business as usual, right? There is atrocities that are happening in this world that we are adamantly supporting, that young people are not getting down with, and they want to see change and they want to be heard. And so I think the way that universities have handled this situation has been really difficult, right? Because this also impacts and impedes the students who are actively protesting their own education, right? And so I think as we're thinking about this upcoming fall semester, we have to be really critical about how we are onboarding and supporting young people into our campus culture, right? What type of setting do we want to say are theirs to learn and to thrive, right? How are we making sure that young people can show and see an active political voice as agent for change, right? We talk about this college campus as a place where we're able to share diversity of thought, diversity of mind, diversity of learning, right? And if we are truly that space, we have to be able to have and make room for those conversations, right? With the young people that I work with and serve, I've urged them and supported them in recognizing that every college campus budget in America is connected to the Israel-Hamas war, right? There has been a long-standing Students for Justice in Palestine who've been working to ensure that they are making sure the funds are going to the appropriate places, right? The same thing that happened with the defund the police movement, right? And so if we are truly these spaces that we claim to be, we have to make room for the conversations and listen to these students.
Travis, you get to decide what gets aired on public TV stations in the state of Maryland. And I assume that those stations are going to be seeing the 5 demands that's going to be aired. Are you seeing more documentaries being made that highlight I'm going to call them the untold histories of people of color? Are you seeing more of those these days?
Yes, I mean, in fact, Maryland Public Television, in addition to what we do in Maryland, we're one of the leading providers of content for PBS stations across the country. So 5 demands, will be distributed across the nation as a part of our effort to increase the films representing people of color across the country. 2 things are happening right now in media, or particularly in PBS. In states that are hostile to diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're seeing a rollback on some of the content that is representative of diversity. And you're seeing political pushback to funding of PBS stations. But at the same time, PBS remains one of the safe places for independent filmmakers to air and distribute content that's dealing with issues that focuses on injustice and requires deeper conversations about issues of race and equity. So the 2 things are true at the same time. And so they're in the post-George Floyd era, there was a rush to include representative films. But as of late, there's been a rollback to those efforts. My optimism is this, that the people, the viewers, who are requiring honest debate and requiring honest discussion, these are the supporters of the PBS system. And as long as they tune in and as long as they demand diverse content, we can meet those demands. As for us at MPT, we think being in the Maryland area, one of the most diverse areas in the nation, we play a unique role. We have a unique responsibility to provide diverse content, not just about Maryland, but to feed the system with films that are made by diverse filmmakers and are authentic stories about diverse people. Our mission is simply this, that we enrich lives and strengthen communities through the power of media. There is a need for authentic storytelling that tells all of our stories, not just a few stories.
We've got about 4 minutes left, which gives each of you about 1 minute and 15 seconds to express any further thoughts that you have about this film. Why don't we start with you, Maria, and then Wisdom, and then Travis.
Just picking up from what Travis said, the story at Brooklyn College is, they did create a documentary about that in 2021, Making the Impossible Possible, the story of Puerto Rican studies at Brooklyn College. So that documentary is out there available. It's short, it's about 30 minutes, and I use it in my classrooms quite a bit. And so that we use, right, to educate students. One of the usefulness of these films is the storytelling. It's that you uncover the hidden, right, facts. You sort of bring into light people's sacrifices, people's struggles for equity and access, right, in education, in higher education and K through 12. And so I think one of the things that is really noteworthy is that if more students, beginning really young, if more students learned about African American studies, Puerto Rican Latinx studies, Native American studies, if they actually learned about the Asian Americans, these, the Middle East, if we learned about this in our grades, there would be much greater understanding of where these conflicts come from, where these tensions come from, and there'll be much more appreciation, right, for our differences and what we bring to the table, instead of trying to hide it or deny it or to ban it. That we've seen, banning of books and banning of curricula, and we would avoid so many problems if we learned about each other. And so I think this film is instrumental in taking this a step further.
Wisdom.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. I think this film is a key to our history. Cheryl, earlier you asked if we were aware of these demands, aware of this movement. And I myself was not until, this was shared with me. But we are in a very unique point in time where there are attacks all across this country on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We just talked about the gutting of affirmative action last summer. There is fear around critical race theory, and all these things that affirm our history, affirm our future, and tell our story. And I think about this phrase my friend says, God cannot bless who we pretend to be. We have to tell the truth. We have to understand our history. We have to learn from our past, such as the Sankofa bird does. We have to look back to move forward. And so if we truly want to be the country we claim to be, if we truly want to be the higher education systems that we claim to be, that support diverse minds, that support diverse solutions, we have to continue to provide resources such as this film and others to ensure that young people have access and knowledge to these movement building moments.
Travis?
You're on mute.
I want to salute Dr. Gonzalez and Mr. Cole and Impact Media Partners and you, Cheryl, for having this discussion, and those who have logged on, and including the filmmakers. This is an important film. MPT is proud to present it. It's part of a long line of films that we're committed to create national debate around these important issues. We produced Harriet Tubman, Visions of Freedom, Becoming Frederick Douglass last year. And in 2025, we are bringing to the screen Becoming Thurgood Marshall, to have a conversation about courage in this nation and what it means in jurisprudence. And so this film is part of a long line of films we are hoping to deliver. Becoming Thurgood Marshall is going to be a part of a national celebration that we're bringing to PBS for HBCU Week, September 2025. Dr. Gonzalez, we're looking to partner with schools like SUNY and really bring HMSIs into the fold, to CUNY, and to bring HMSIs into the fold, excuse me. And so we want to make sure that we are using public media to bring a wide swath of people into this conversation. So public media, we believe, is the place where films like The Five Demands should be seen and produced, and there's a need for many, many more of them.
I want to thank our panelists for joining us in this discussion today. And my main takeaway from the film is it affirms the fact that students are so often the agents of change, whether in the civil rights movement, in the anti-Vietnam movement, in the anti-communist movement, in Tiananmen Square, in opposition to the Israel-Hamas war. And their actions are often the spur that forces governments and institutions to make big changes. Thank you so much.